Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorraine Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Are we in for a treat today? Our guest is Helen Macdonald, author of H is for Hawk. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Hello, everyone.
Yes, well, tell us a little about your background and how you ended up being this international best-selling, award-winning writer.
That was a bit of a shock. I didn't expect that. You know, I wrote this book about the strange thing I did after my father died. I trained a hawk, and I thought it was an odd book and no one would read it, and suddenly it just caught fire, and it's been a bestseller here and in Europe. And you know, I was an academic historian. I worked at the University of Cambridge as a historian of science. You know, my audiences were very small. And now here I am. It's been a really wonderful journey.
Well, you've won the Samuel Johnson Award for nonfiction. You've won the Costa Book Award. You New York Times bestselling, international bestselling. Your background, you're a naturalist, a British naturalist, and you're a scholar at Cambridge University.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you that your book, and I want to show it here, it's called H is for Hawk. And it's been called an instant classic. It's been called all sorts of things. I've never read a book like it,
Wow.
and I absolutely love it. I'm supposed to have some critical distance, but I've just never read anything like it. So you always love birds.
You know, it's true. This is a very open book emotionally. It's about the death of my father in many respects. But there's one thing in this book that I'm still embarrassed about confessing, and that is when I was very small, I loved hawks and birds so much that I used to try and sleep with my arms behind my back like wings. You know, I was an obsessed child. All my friends had pictures of pop stars on their bedroom walls, and I had pictures of birds of prey and kestrels, you know. And I wanted to be a falconer. I wanted to train birds of prey, and I did that for many years. I was this, you know, I worked in various places, and then I became a historian and sort of forgot about it. But that was for a while, until I came back to it, you know, after my father died. But that was my big thing when I was a child. You know, I really loved these birds.
Even to the point where at age 8 you read T.H. White's book called The Goshawk.
Yeah, it's a really sad book, that one.
Yeah, he didn't have the network and support system in place to do it in what is now the accepted way.
Yeah, he was a very sad man, and I'm sure many people listening and watching this will know him from The Sword in the Stone and The Once and Future King, those great Arthurian legends, the retellings of these legends he did. Yeah, and he grew up in a sort of very miserable household in British India, and he had a horrible time at school, and he really struggled with who he was, and he tried to train a hawk not knowing how to do it, and this book he wrote about it is so heartbreaking. And I was kind of obsessed with it when I was younger. I hated it, but I kind of was drawn to it. Yeah.
Well, you also said that while you had experience as a falconer and with kestrels and merlins, you viewed goshawks as, what did you call them, psychopaths. And what is their reputation in the aviary world, in the raptor world?
In the falconry world, they're kind of the Christopher Walken of birds, right? They sort of have this reputation as being psychopathic, murderous, feathered shotguns. And they were very much boys' birds when I was growing up. You know, they were things that I didn't ever want to handle.
To the point where even the term to train a hawk is to man a hawk. Isn't that true?
Yeah, falconry has been a bit of a boys' game for a few centuries. You know, if you go back to the 11th and 12th century, it wasn't. You know, women trained all these big hawks too, but then something happened. And when I was a kid and I wanted to be a falconer, I didn't know any other women or young women that wanted to do it. And I was a bit strange, you know. But goshawks were always beyond the pale. And my father suddenly died, and it was all I could think about was getting a goshawk.
Well, tell us a little about your dad. You paint such a wonderful picture of him and his lessons for you. It's hard.
It's
I know.
hard, right?
I know.
It was he died in 2007 very suddenly of a heart attack while he was out taking photographs. He was a press photographer, a very good one, and of course my brother and I never realized how good he was. You know, when you have parents, you never know how professional they are. And but he was also an incredibly kind man and very interested in the natural world. And he taught me so many lessons about life, about how to be patient, about how to take joy in seeing things, you know, seeing celestial events, meteor showers, eclipses. He loved field guides, you know, those books that teach you how to identify things. And we were both kind of nerds, I guess, and we were best friends. And I think that's something that I've been very surprised about over my time touring with this book are the number of women have come up to me and said, why does no one talk about that relationship between father and daughter? It's such an extraordinary friendship when it works, and it's not really something we talk about.
And in his profession as a photographer, there was the sense of being a watcher or the observer, and you had always grown up. That was one of your strong points, your ability to watch and to observe what was going on. He, in his youth, watched the World War II planes coming over, plane spotting.
He was a terrible plane spotter. I mean, at the end of the book, there's a bit where I find his old plane spotting diaries, and I discover that when he was a teenager, he used to bicycle miles and miles with his notebooks to watch these things flying in. 12 hours a day, he'd sort of sit watching these planes. I mean, what an extraordinary thing to do.
And you were looking up, too, but you were looking at the birds.
Yeah, I was a bird obsessive, as I said. I mean, I remember when I was a child learning all the birds of Britain slowly, one by one. It's quite stressful being in America. I'm pretty good at American birds, but, there are always ones I think, what is that noise? I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
It's quite exciting to be here.
Well, speaking of British birds, in the late 19th century, the hawks were exterminated in Britain.
Yeah.
So you had to get European... You actually worked providing hawks and falcons for the Middle Eastern princes. Is that true?
Yeah, there's some big conservation issues with Arab falconry in the Gulf states. It's a very traditional thing there. It's come to stand for a very sort of strong marker of Gulf Arab identity. But a lot of them were being taken from the wild. So I worked out there in the 1990s for a while. We were captive breeding birds and trying to persuade local falconers to use these captive bred birds rather than wild ones. It was amazing out there. I mean, I met amazing people. Very, very different from my home in England, yeah.
And when you were in England, we had almost like buy one, get one free. You would, British falconers or hawk people would buy a hawk from abroad, and they get another one to let loose, and you now have reestablished somewhat of a population of goshawks.
Absolutely true. And in many countries, like the condor, for example, here you've had these reintroduction programs. In Britain, it was kind of unofficial. These goshawks were wiped out by shooting in the 19th century and habitat loss, and these falconers would bring them in to fly birds for falconry, and they'd sort of buy one, set one free was what they did. They used to let... And we've got goshawks back in England, which is wonderful. Yeah.
So your father died suddenly, and you were just stunned.
Yeah.
And your writing is so beautiful. You would put that memories are like heavy blocks of glass, and you would try to arrange them to make all of this make sense, and it wouldn't. And you started having these dreams about hawks. Tell us how Mabel came into your life.
Well, yeah, I just, there was a funeral. It was very hard. My mum and my brother and I were, clinging together. And I went back to my house in Cambridge where I was teaching. And I thought, well, this is, now we're just going to recover slowly. But I started dreaming of goshawks every single night. And this one particular bird, a wild one that we'd sort of rescued years before at this centre where I worked and let it go. It just slipped through the air into nothing. It seemed to disappear. And that was the one I dreamt about.
Well, when you were with that one, because you write about it so beautifully, you thought about the reptilianness of her and the scent of the goshawk feathers. And then you suddenly realized that she was bigger than you and older, this old reptilian presence.
Really strange. I mean, being close to that bird, I said she was muscled as a pit bull and so intimidating, this bird. And then she looked right at me, and it was like looking at a dinosaur. And I realized that, I was just this kind of, I'm just a mammal, right? I mean, these things were old and extraordinary, and I kept dreaming of goshawks, and I decided that I needed one. I mean, I think after a bereavement, often the decisions you make happen at a level that's way below consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
It's all, you're sort of compelled to do things. And I was, I don't recommend it as a way of dealing with grief generally, but I decided that I needed to have a goshawk in my life.
So training goshawk is quite a process. I mean, it is like reading Moby Dick, in that I learned a lot about whales, and I learned so much about hawks, but each thing I learned kind of whetted my desire to know more. So you said you had, when the training process, you got this beautiful young hawk, you had to become invisible, and some way you talked about the gap between fear and food, which you, as a falconer, had to gap somehow. But describe what you went through in training this beautiful bird, because you said you would sit with it and almost not breathe and not blink for hours.
It's very intense, this dance that you have to have with a new hawk, because they've never been domesticated. There's such an old partnership between humans and birds of prey, but every time the bird is terribly wild and terribly frightened of you to start with. And the way that you start to instill trust in this bird is to give it gifts of raw meat. And slowly the bird will come to see you as a benevolent presence. But it's very intense, and you have to kind of almost will yourself into not being there in order to not scare the bird to start with. But as the days go past in your kind of monkish seclusion with this bird, it starts to trust you, and it's an extraordinary moment when this bird first starts to, look forward to seeing you and sort of jump to your hand for food and then fly to you. And it's, it's so ancient. I mean, there were falconers, we're talking sort of 4,000 years BC, and the idea that, I'm just one of that long line of people that have done precisely this with birds that haven't changed. It's very heady.
Yes. You describe, there's something, city people and there's a lot of cultures that have lost touch with nature at all, let alone wildlife, and they have a sort of Disney expectation of Bambi and Thumper and a very bucolic sense of what nature is about without looking at the prey hunter sort of relationship. You describe taking the hawk and going to this bucolic setting where bunnies are munching and pheasants are moving through the undergrowth, and thinking, how did you describe the hawk on your hand?
I said, and this is a sort of slight cuss word here, I said that she was like the bastard offspring of a flaming torch and an assault rifle. Yeah. And that's what she felt like. She was in hunting mode. And I knew that keeping a hawk, I was going to let her hunt. I think that, that's part of what they are. But it was a very, very weird experience, going out there and seeing this bird doing what they do. And the thing that was really extraordinary about this was that, the goshawks, they're not very clean killers. They're very powerful. And once they catch things, they just start eating. And at some point, this poor thing's going to expire. So I had to run in and put these rabbits and pheasants out of their misery very quickly. And that was a very, very serious and difficult thing to do for me morally. I mean, I wasn't morally upset about it, but it was hard. And it made me realize we just don't see death anymore. It happens behind walls mostly now. And it was a very serious education into the way the world works, I think.
Well, one is able to be in touch with, the life in the wild much more than we do even on PBS documentaries, BBC documentaries. I mean, it's hard for some people to accept.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so this is not a nature book like other nature books. The otters, there's Gavin the Otter, all these wonderful nature books.
No, and people have sort of said, this is a book about someone who was very sad and got a hawk and then was happy. And I'm like, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. The hawk took me to some quite dark places before I crawled back into the human world. But again, she taught me a lot about how the world works. And I'm deeply grateful to that bird for showing me a lot of things that I didn't know before. So in your sense of watching, of what you had, a pattern you had in your whole life, and continued your father's powers of observation, as you had a long experience with this beautiful bird. Tell us what was revealed to you, because this is not an ordinary grief book. This is not an ordinary nature book. You've created a unique masterpiece. They're calling it an instant classic. So, so I know that's too much, but. And we're speaking today with Helen Macdonald, who wrote H's for Hawk. So as you went down the path and observed training the hawk and what the hawk taught you, what was revealed to you about what you've been going through about grief? Well, I guess it took me a while to work out what was going on. And deep down, I obviously had flown to this hawk because I wanted to be like her. I wanted to be this solitary, self-possessed, kind of raging, raw creature of wildness. I didn't want to feel human emotions. I didn't want to feel the grief for my father. I wanted to run away. So in a way, the hawk was kind of a bit like, I could have taken drugs or got into drink or had inadvisable affairs, but I chose a goshawk to lose myself, to obliterate my sense of myself. And that was kind of dangerous. When I was flying her, it was a very beautiful and exquisite experience, going out for hours every day with her. But ultimately, I realized that I'd gone way too far into the wild and I needed to come back. And I'd got quite depressed as well. And I ended up going to the doctors and getting on antidepressants and trying to find my way back to the world I'd run away from. But in the end, the deepest message of the book, I think, is that we all do this sort of thing all the time with nature. We always give it meanings that reflect our own views of the world. And it's impossible for us not to do that without realizing it. But eventually, I sort of understood that you can look past those meanings and see the real creatures there, and that's the great joy. Mabel was so different from me. She's a bird. But we still shared this life. And that was a gift. That was a proper gift.
So it's so beautifully written. This is extraordinary. Two of my favorite lines. The hawk filled the house with wildness, like a bowl of lilies fills a house with its scent.
Yeah, that's how it felt.
And you speak so much about the prehistoric, mossy, granite odor of this hawk. It's not like anything else.
Yeah, I remember a falconer once writing that the smell of hawk breath is unexpectedly amazing, and he thought that maybe, expensive perfume manufacturers should bottle it in little smoked glass falcons and sell it. It's a very, very strange and transporting odor. But yeah, I never thought I had a very strong sense of smell, but I have a friend on Twitter who's a perfume expert, and she said, yeah, there's a lot of smell in this book. And I'm thinking,
yeah, there is.
Really?
There's a lot of senses in this book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of visuals, the sky, the woods. It's a very sensual book. Everything, the sound of the birds, everything is right there.
Well,
so I found it very immediate and very real.
That's really nice to hear, and I think that again was a consequence of grief. I think after a big shock, you lose all the skins that you've built to protect yourself from the world, and it becomes a very raw and bright and sharp place. And I wanted to get that across in the writing.
Well, one of the things that's revealed to you, and it evolves very naturally through the book, but you ultimately, what is it, the saying, the phrase that you said about grief? Grief is love with no place to go.
Oh, that line.
Oh.
It's so true, and I'm so amused by this line in many ways, because I think it might have come from one of those Scandi crime dramas on television, right?
Uh-huh.
And I heard it, and I'm like, oh, well, that's it. That's the line. That's the line that explains so much about what it's like. It's love with no place to go. It's all that emotion, all that desperate frustration that the thing that you love is not there anymore, and yet you feel the love and it hurts. And yeah, that's what it is, and it's lonely and it's hard and it's something that happens to everyone.
Well, but everyone doesn't get through it. Well, of course not with a hawk, but some people, maybe even after 10 years, have not come to that point. It's very restorative to realize that that's what it is, love with nowhere to go. And then you'd say, well, thank you that I was given this gift of this love, and I'm going to redirect it, or maybe even self-direct it.
Yeah. One of the most moving and humbling things about this whole experience with this book coming out is having opportunity to go on tour and meet readers. And so many of them afterwards talked with me about their own losses, and some of those losses are of a magnitude so much greater than mine. And yeah, we're all in it. We all suffer it, and it's very, very hard. And I don't know. I guess it just makes me feel that we're never taught this when we're small. I say somewhere else in the book, I say that when we're small, we think the world's always going to be full of new things, and then one day you think, no, wait a minute, that's not how it is. The world is going to be full of absences as we get older. Mm-hmm. And recognizing that and realizing that's how it is another big moment, I think, in people's lives,
But one of the other lines that I love so much is about a presence. You say, the weight of the hawk on your arm was like a lame man putting on an accustomed wooden leg after it had been lost. So that realization that it's absences that are in our future as well as novelties.
Yes.
That felt to me like putting on the missing leg. It really felt, that's true to me in my experience.
Yeah. No.
But I have not heard it so well expressed.
Well, thank you. That's a line. I think that line comes from T.H. White, who was one of those. Another strand of the book is about, as you know, about the writer T.H. White.
Yes.
And he had that ability to put things succinctly and with extreme beauty. I remember one time reading about him bicycling along an English lane under overarching trees as being like cycling on the inside of a snake. He was he had this ability to just capture things in a single sentence. It's amazing.
So now you're traveling. I want to direct people who will love your writing. You have a monthly column, a nature column in the New York Times.
Well, I've been doing that for a year, and I'm both delighted to say that I'm continuing to write for them, and a bit sad to say the column is no longer going to happen. But what I'm doing now is even better. I'm going to be writing huge features for the magazine, again about natural history and about our relationship to the natural world. I think it's the most important subject there is right now. We're living in this very dark time for the environment. The sixth great extinction is upon us. So trying to understand why we see the world of nature the way we do, I think, is really important. So I'm having to have more space to do that. So look out for those.
I've recently interviewed Jane Goodall, and one of her well, she's of course working hard to preserve the creatures and the environment, but she says, in 100 years, the people then are going to look back at the extinctions that we've allowed, and there might be no more elephants, there might be no more polar bears, there might be no more giraffes. I mean, these are and then all the insects and the amphibians that we're losing too. And I thank you for your efforts. This book does a lot to wake people up to think look what we have now, let's not lose it. Thank you.
That's very good to hear. I'm very glad that that's one of the messages that comes across in these pages.
So you are a bird-hearted person. Mabel is no longer with us.
Sadly, no. She died very suddenly a few years ago of a horrible fungal infection called aspergillosis. I miss her to bits. I really do. I've still got a vase of her malted feathers on my desk, which is a bit sentimental.
But you now have a new bird friend.
Yeah, I have a parrot now. My friends tell me it's emotionally more healthy than a hawk because it's cuddly, but I swear to everyone, listening and watching this, that I have more scars from that parrot than I ever have had from a hawk. Because if you upset a hawk, it just gets upset. If you upset a parrot, it remembers, right?
Right.
So, yeah. No, it's great. I love it so much.
One of the things you said about scars, about Mabel, the goshawk, was that you could count. One of the things that happens when she inadvertently attacks you and you're bleeding and it's horrible and you have to go to your friend and say help, but then you sit down and you write your father's obituary. Your memoir, for the piece that you had to write. It's like you said, she struck sense into you finally.
It was one of those moments where it was almost like some kind of spiritual moment where the hawk had taught me something. And I was trying to think of the eulogy for my father's memorial service. It was extremely hard to do. I couldn't think of what to do. And then one day I was she didn't do it on purpose. I was trying to get this pheasant out of a hedge, and I stuck my head through the hedge, and she was on top of the hedge getting very excited and trying to see this pheasant. And she saw my head coming through, and I think she just thought it was her prey. And she dived down and bounced off me, and it was like being hit with a sort of baseball bat full of nails, and I was bleeding everywhere, and and she was kind of a bit sort of nonplussed by all this. But that moment, that sort of knocked sense into me, and I went home and I just wrote this eulogy straight out. The world is full of weird moments like that.
Yeah, and you write about them so well. You talk about all the scars on your hands and your face and everything you got from her, but you said the other scars are the scars that she healed.
Yeah.
The emotional, psychic, spiritual scars from this great loss. She really served to help heal them.
She did, and I think one of the things that we do with animals without realizing it quite a lot of the time is use them as almost like proxies for other parts of ourselves that we can't otherwise be. Mabel was all the things in myself I couldn't recognize or couldn't deal with. She was all this sort of post-grief kind of anger and power and wildness. And I think we all do this with animals. I was talking to a psychotherapist recently in a non-professional capacity. We were having tea, and he said he has a woman who comes to therapy with a dog. And she has problems expressing her emotions, but she quite often says in the sessions, "My dog is angry with you," right? And everyone knows what's going on apart from the dog. But I think, it's safe. It's safe to use animals as to sort of stand for parts of ourselves. And I think that's what Mabel was partly for. But she was also an extraordinary character and a real live bird. So, she wasn't just a symbol.
No, she was in the flesh, on the flesh, and eating the flesh.
Yes, she was all those things.
So you now have a small green parrot, and are you writing?
Well, I'm not writing in the same way. It's no longer kind of weeks of sort of weeping at my desk and eating junk food, and writing a book is very lonely and hard. It's very exciting as well.
But writing a book instigated by the death of your father,
right? It was emotionally quite tough to do. I'm writing for the New York Times Magazine, and I know there's another book to come at some point, but I just have to calm down a bit, because this is very, very intensive. This
you also you're touring, you're in a different city all the time, and people come to you saying, "Oh, thank you for this book." I'm really pleased that I've read that it's going to be made into a film. And tell us who...
This is so funny. I'm a creature of muddy English hillsides, and the other day I was in LA having a meeting with a whole bunch of film people, including the wonderful Lena Headey, who plays Queen Cersei in Game of Thrones,
Lannister
right?
in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, she bought the option, and I think she wants to play me. And I met her, and she I instantly just thought, this is the most wonderful person, and she really gets the book. But yeah, it's very surreal, and sometimes I sort of pinch myself and think, is this really happening? but, I'm going to just enjoy it while it lasts. It's been incredible.
So I find your writing now everywhere. There was a column in this week that they asked you your favorite books, but these were just books that you really liked. So
yeah, nature books I really liked. Yeah.
and a lot of them were about birds. But thank goodness your first one was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That started everything, and especially for the birds because of the DDT and their eggs and all of that. And how long ago was that? 50s?
That was in the
60s?
60s, and
Yeah.
of course the sad thing about that is when I first read that, I really believed that they were the bad old days. It was all solved now, and you look at what's going on, and we still have huge problems with chemical contamination and pesticides, and it's as if we haven't learnt those lessons. So it's a book that's not only a book about one success and about loving the natural world, but also about, it's a cautionary tale as well. Yeah.
Well, from your own cautionary tale, do you have any advice to people who come to this book for, as Poe says, surcease of sorrow, who are looking, who are in a state of grief themselves?
Well, some people I've found it's too close. Some people it's too much, because I do talk very directly about what it's like, that moment, those physical, visceral effects of grief. But, it's hard to talk about grief, and what I hadn't expected with this book is that, anywhere where you feel someone else is talking about grief and sharing that experience can be helpful. So maybe it will be helpful to read about someone else's miserable time. But, I guess, be gentle to yourself. Keep breathing. It will get better, but it takes a long time. You never get over it. You just become a new person that can incorporate that grief within yourself. That's what happens eventually.
And that wonderful concept that grief is love with nowhere to go.
Exactly.
I found that very, very transformative, too.
Oh, well, I'm glad that was helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So our guest today is Helen Macdonald, and her book is called Shaler's Fish. And this beautiful New York Times bestseller, H is for Hawk. I know you'll love it. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's been so lovely. Thank you very much.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.